Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. This following conversation was recorded at the Lannan Literary Festival at Georgetown University in Washington. My guest is a fiction writer, an essayist and a journalist. Her work most often concerns issues related to youth, migration, the environment and her home state of California. In addition to writing, she's spent 15 years working at the intersection of education and immigration. She teaches writing at the Ashland University MFA in Writing programme and the University of San Francisco. Her latest book is A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. Lauren Markham, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here.
We're actually speaking in Washington, D.C., where we're at the Lannan Center Literary Festival, which has just been fabulous so far. And we're going to be talking today, in fact, about A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belongings, which is your most recent book. It's been called A Remarkable, Unnerving and Cautionary Portrait of a Global Immigration Crisis. And of course, immigration, migration, youth issues is where you've spent a lot of your working life. But I want to go right back to the beginning for you to tell me about your family, about your childhood. You're of Greek origin.
A small part of my family is Greek. So my grandmother was Greek, and her mother and father immigrated from Greece in the Ellis Island era. But that story and that sort of heritage loomed really large as I grew up. And that was the sort of story of belonging and the origin story that we were given, and we were sort of told, you're Greek and that's who you are, that's who we are, even though actually, my cousins and even my parents' generation didn't have a connection to contemporary modern day Greece. It was more as a source, as a place that we're from. And I think that that's one of the things I explore in the book, because I think that that's something that a lot of European Americans of European descent, especially of Ellis Island era, have this sense of roots and connections, even if they don't actually have a lived experience of the place that they trace these very, meaningful roots.
Everybody needs an origin story, you write.
Yes, exactly. I think we pine for that and long for that. And I actually think that that is part of the sickness of the identity crisis here in this country and all over the world, and the rise in white supremacy I trace in this book and really feel after sort of deep research and thinking about this, that is in part emerging from this sense of rootlessness and a sense of who are we, where do we come from, and a desire for an origin story of valor and of greatness. And that's certainly with Greece. Ancient Greece is a darling of white supremacist movements, because there's this notion of, the birthplace of civilization, where we all came from, this great white origin story, which of course is a total fiction, but it's one that's instrumentalized and used from, stormfront chat rooms all the way to leaders holding public office.
And you talk in the book about how Greek immigrants first in America were seen as non-white, as something lesser, and how that's progressed throughout the decades.
Yeah, absolutely. In this country, which in the United States, where we are right now, in the heart of it, in Washington, D.C., this has always been a country of immigrants since it became a country. And the newest people to come are always sort of the punching bags, right? They're scourges of the earth. They're bringing diseases. They're lesser than. They are polluting our country, and there are too many of them, and they must be stopped. And that was said about the Greeks, that was said about the Irish, and that is, of course, said now largely about Latinx immigrants coming to the United States. But, similarly, Afghans going to Greece or Pakistanis going to the UK, right? So there's a long history of exclusion, and how quickly those of us whose ancestors were victims of the exclusion forget and kind of turn our guns or turn our bricks on the newest arrivals.
When did being a migrant or an immigrant become a crime?
It's such a fascinating question. Is I think one of the things that my book is tracing. I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture of it, but it is true that in ancient Greece and in many ancient societies, there was this notion, this moral notion, that asylum or some version of that, an outsider comes to you asking for protection, that it was a moral duty of not just human beings, but of like the political sphere to offer that protection to that person. And so how did we get from that, thousands of years ago to where we are now, where migrants are cast as criminals, and we are increasingly, destination countries that are increasingly criminalizing the act of migration and trying to stop it at all costs? It's hard to pinpoint, but I will say that, in this country, under Ronald Reagan was the first time that a private immigration detention facility was opened, run by a private corporation. And under Ronald Reagan was the first time that we created an immigration detention quota, which is to say, okay, 10,000 people must be locked up at any time. That wasn't the beginning, because that stemmed from somewhere. It's always hard to pinpoint, like, what is the beginning? But certainly since then, since in this country, since we've been twining profit and detention, right, and profit and punishment in the immigration sphere. We've long been doing that in the criminal justice sphere. But since then, there has been an incentive, a financial incentive to criminalize immigration. And at the same time, we see everywhere, from Hungary to Greece to the UK to France to here in the United States, that immigrants are a really useful, and this has long been true, again, since like Ellis Island generation and even before in the United States, but immigrants are a very, very convenient political tool for autocrats, for strongmen, for right-wing leaders who want to be able to say, your suffering is not because of what's happening in this country or because of what your politicians have or haven't done for you. Your suffering is a result of these people coming from the outside. And that then makes it really much easier to convince a population that migrants are criminals and bad people who need to be stopped.
Let's go back to your own personal life, because as we've established, you're from a Greek background. Yeah. But have you always written?
I have always written. I actually got a master's in fine arts in fiction writing when I was in my early 20s, and just was writing sort of maybe nice sentences, but like terrible short stories that no one, I hope no one ever finds and no one ever reads. But yeah, I've always written. I wrote when I was a little girl. I wrote all throughout college. It did take me a pretty long time to figure out that journalism, because I now, am a journalist, not only a journalist and sometimes a reluctant journalist. It did take me a while, not till my late 20s, to figure out like, oh, journalism is a way, especially long form journalism, the kind that I write. Journalism is a way to write about things that I really care about.
But you haven't just been a writer, you've also been a teacher. Now tell us about that part of your life.
Yeah, so I have been working with forced migration and with refugee and immigrant communities for a really long time. And when I did some of that in college, I helped start a school in 2000. I worked at a refugee resettlement agency in the US. I worked for various nonprofits. And in 2007, I helped start a school for recently arrived immigrant youth in Oakland, California. And that's a school I helped build, first as a community support member and then as a staff member. I took a couple years off, but I'm back. I'm still working there in very part-time capacity. And it has always felt really meaningful to me, not only to inquire into structures of justice and injustice in the writing world, but actually work and try to be some agent of change or belonging in the world itself beyond writing. For me personally, the combination of writing and some sort of more active pursuit in the world where I'm actually doing something on a day-to-day basis, that is where I find most happiness, I think, is in that balance.
Tell us about exactly what it is you do in that day-to-day, though.
Yeah, well, I will say now it's a lot less interesting. I feel like, as my husband put it, like, you are helping contribute to a functional environment. And I'm like, yes, that is true. So I do a lot of grant writing, and I do some kind of coaching and programmatic development, and actually teaching other people, other educators, about what our school does and how to kind of replicate that model. So it's much less interesting. But for many, many years, I was kind of a combination between a social worker and an assistant principal. Our students come from, in any given year, around 30 different countries. They're all recently arrived immigrant English language learners, and it's one of the highest poverty rates of any school in Oakland, California. And this is a public school, so, a government school. So in my role as sort of half assistant principal, half social worker, my job was supporting students outside of the classroom. So to connect with immigration attorneys, to have meaningful after school programs to help them improve their English, to find housing for their families when their house, when they got kicked out by their landlord. So kind of dealing with everything outside of the classroom, the theory being, which is sort of both obvious and I think not stated enough, that so many of the obstacles happening inside the classroom for young people don't actually have to do with what's happening in the classroom, but what's happening in their worlds and lives, around them.
And now, tell us about your first book, which was called The Faraway Brothers, Two Young Migrants and the Making of an American Life.
Yeah, so that is a book. I published it in 2017, and it is a book tracing the story of two identical twins, one of whom got on the wrong side of the wrong person in his small town of El Salvador. These young people were born in this sort of moment of optimism in the wake of the Salvadoran Civil War, but then kind of came of age in tandem with the rise of the gangs in El Salvador, which were, of course, really exports from Los Angeles in the U.S. So it's the story of these identical twins.
Factual story?
Yes, a factual story. So one of the young men gets on the wrong side of the wrong person in town. The gangs are after him. He has to leave essentially pretty quickly, like overnight, because he's afraid for his life. And then because his identical twin looks exactly like him, he too needs to go because he's afraid he'll be mistaken for his brother. So it's the story of their upbringing. It's the story of their flight out of the United States. And then about half the book really takes place in Oakland, California. I met them actually. I've been reporting on unaccompanied minors for a long time, but I met them at the school where I worked that I was just speaking about. And about half the book takes place in Oakland as they tangle with the vast apparatus of exclusion. The people are trying to kick them out of the country, and they need to go to court, and they need to find a lawyer, and they have to go to school, but they also have to pay their rent. So it's really sort of following their day-to-day struggles within the vast immigration machinery of the United States.
And that whole young migrant or unaccompanied migrant story, I mean, is absolutely huge here in the US at the moment. Where are we in terms of government policy on it? Because it does seem to be a lot of push and shove in terms of different states and what the law actually is saying.
I mean, so the law hasn't changed that much. It is effectively that if you come here as a minor, so under the age of 18, you are not locked up, and you come here alone, as in not in the custody of your parents. You're not locked up in a adult detention facility or even a family detention facility, but you're put in what's called, I'm using air quotes here, a child-friendly detention center. And the goal is for the government to release you out of that detention center as quickly as possible into the care of some adult. And that might actually be a parent who is already here, or it could be an uncle or a cousin or a neighbor. And the goal is for them to make that transfer as soon as possible. And the young people fight their immigration cases from outside of detention. It's incredibly difficult to get a lawyer. Wait times are many years. I think that that's one of the real, and I know that this is true in Europe too, having reported extensively there, that, on the one hand, you're being told you'll likely be deported, but on the other hand, lines are so long and wait times are so long that it could be years before you even have your day in court. So you're in this really protracted limbo situation in which you're sort of told, don't get comfortable here and don't make a life. And yet, 2 years for anyone's life, and certainly in the life of a 16-year-old or 17-year-old, that's quite a bit of time. So one of the things, though, that I find about unaccompanied minors that's interesting is that, again, because the profile of the migrant is so often manipulated and used for political gain, there's a way in which it's convenient to cast unaccompanied minors as innocents and as victims, and sort of say, well, these are okay because they're children, but the real bad guys are these other guys. So I sometimes, worry about the profile of the unaccompanied migrant being manipulated for sort of nefarious anti-immigration ends.
And this it sort of dovetails into the whole idea of myth-making, which is something that your new book, A Map of Future Ruins, is very much about. Just explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it took me a while to understand that this is a book, A Map of Future Ruins, my most recent book, is really a book about storytelling, and concerned with how we tell stories and the consequences of what stories are told, and how stories, even what we might imagine as factual stories or understand as factual stories can kind of take on mythic proportions. That is to say, can become outsized in terms of the value and meaning that we give them. Or mythological, mythic proportions in the sense that, like, maybe there are some bends of the truth here and this isn't the whole story, right? And so I was really interested in tracing that within my own family. To what degree is this idea of we are Greek and that's who we are? I'm only a quarter Greek, but that is like the identity that I grew up with. To what extent are these mythologies and effectively stories that we tell backwards to explain who we are? To what extent is that happening with regard to migration in individual families like mine? To what degree are we mythologizing migrants as journalists in the news? Because I think, unfortunately in the media landscape, and I'm certainly a part of that media landscape, there is a tendency to either cast immigrants as, marauding invaders or, as on the other side, as sort of perfect angels who, deserving of only sympathy. And in either case, there's some sort of flattening and mythologizing happening. And I'm also interested in the mythologies we tell about migration as nation states, as countries, sort of saying, these immigrants are good, these are not good. Well, back, or, as my own family says, like back in the Ellis Island era, at least we had a system, you had to go through. So there was a line and you got in it, and that's what our great-grandparents did. So this is really dissecting some of those mythologies and trying to kind of shine a light on them and investigate and consider what the consequences are of these stories we tell and how they affect future policy, right? Because the way we understand the past determines the decisions we make now that impact people tomorrow.
And what about the crossover with Greek myth?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. The most obvious myth I sort of left behind. Well, that was what was fascinating to me. The A Map of Future Ruins, it does a lot of things and goes a lot of places, and it's asking a lot of questions, but its locus, its physical geographic locus is Greece. So Greece is where my own family traces origins, and Greece is, where I've done a lot of reporting in recent years. In fact, I was just there 2 weeks ago looking at the so-called migration crisis, and it certainly is a crisis in the sense of how migrants are being treated and the experience that forced migrants have in Greece. And so this sort of overlap between, okay, my family traces an origin story to Greece and contemporary migrants are coming to Greece was fascinating enough to me. But there's also this element of the mythology of ancient Greece that is all about journeying, right? And these journeys that are taken and these valorous, the journey is valorous in Greek mythology, right? And in Greek history. And I guess that kind of gets back to that like lovely question you had about like, when did migration become a crime? Like, when did the journey curdle from the territory of the hero to the territory of the wretch? When did the journey itself become a crime? And so I was very fascinated in the mythologies of ancient Greece, and also the mythology of Greece itself as a civilizational origin story, as this so-called birthplace of the West. While of course there's a lot of historical lines that can be traced from, here again in Washington, D.C., contemporary politics in the U.S. back to ancient Greece. This idea of...
Even the architecture.
Exactly, the neocolonial architecture, which I talk about this in the book, but, especially for listeners abroad, this was so troubling to me. Under the Trump administration, there was a decree, an edict he put out called, a federal order called Make American Buildings Beautiful Again. And it was all about sort of a mandated neoclassical style. We must go back, which again, the Greeks are a darling, a co-opted darling. The ancient Greeks are a co-opted darling of white supremacists. So this notion of Greece as this perfect, as the writer Kwame Anthony Appiah writes, this notion of Greece as this golden nugget that has been transferred all the way from then to now is totally false and a myth in and of itself. So I'm just interested in these stories, and that's what this book is tangling with, the way these stories are told and the way we trick ourselves into believing things about the past because we desire a story of the present to be true.
Let's talk about where this is set and the sort of immediate story that you follow within it, because it's in a particular refugee camp and there is a particular inciting incident, if you like.
Yeah, so this book opens with a fire that burned down the largest refugee camp in Europe. That was Moria refugee camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. And, as we know, Europe has largely externalized its borders to the border regions, just like the U.S. does in Texas and Arizona, but with slightly more complexity complexity because, I mean, it's all complex, but, many of the outer countries of the European Union are some of the least resourced countries. So Europe has externalized its borders to Greece, and then Greece in turn has said, okay, we're actually going to keep all refugees on these 5 hotspot islands. So the people of those hotspot islands sort of feel like, okay, well, now Greece has externalized this border issue to us. So the Greek Lesbos is where the highest number of refugees have come over since 2015. And so there was this refugee camp. It was built for 2,500 people, expanded to accommodate 3,500. During the peak pandemic, there were about 20,000 people living there. At the time of the fire in September 2020, there were about 11,000 people living there. And one night it went up in flames, like completely destroyed this camp. It set all of these refugees once again on the run. They were marooned on this stretch of road between the camp and the city because the police wouldn't let them into the city. And in the other direction, they were blocked by groups of fascists who, didn't want them coming into their towns. And pretty quickly, the Greek government announced that they had found the perpetrators. After that announcement, they arrested 6 young Afghans based on the testimony of a single eyewitness who has completely gone missing. No, he's never been seen. He's never come to court. And they arrested these young people and charged them with the crime of burning Moria down. And so that is the central story throughout the book is, the story of this camp, the story of this fire, and the story of these young people who, with very, very, very little, zero credible evidence against them, were fingered for this crime.
Now, most of these migrants are experiencing trauma in some way, but you also go into the fact that there's secondary trauma amongst those that work with them and even those that are set up to judge them.
Yes. I did a piece a while back looking at vicarious trauma among immigration attorneys, which then also led me to studies on vicarious trauma among immigration judges in the U.S. and also asylum officers. And it's this very interesting phenomenon that, as I sort of write about in the book, that it is not easy to be an asylum officer hearing these stories again and again. And one of a particular perverse challenge that refugees face is, they have to narrate their experience in detail again and again in order to be believed. Like that is a kind of requirement for getting asylum or protection in most destination countries today. That's not actually true for, tens of thousands of people who migrate from, or who, flee overnight from Somalia into Kenya, for instance. But in, countries in the global north, we sort of require refugees to sort of say one by one, prove that you need protection and that you qualify. And one of the really perverse elements is that they're often disbelieved because their stories sound so similar, which is, of course their stories are going to sound similar because the way the gangs work in El Salvador have a logic and an order and a consistency, and the way that the experiences that young people had in Afghanistan that, forced them to flee for their lives, tend to look pretty similar. So there's sort of like a calcifying and a shutting down, I think, of empathy and kind of compassion that can happen among, frankly, actually advocates too, but among the people, as you sort of put it, who are there to try to litigate whether or not they should stay, and are often trying to keep them out. But there's also this thing that happens that, as much as their work is to try to keep people out and might sort of tend to start to disbelieve people, these people face incredible health challenges and mental health challenges because they are hearing these horrific stories again and again and again. And so it's an interesting thing that this vicarious trauma actually creates a shutdown mechanism for a lot of people, where it's like, I'm going to disbelieve this because for it to be true again and again and again is almost too much for a human to bear.
What effect has it had on you?
It's funny because when I was doing this piece on vicarious trauma among immigration attorneys in the States, I realized that I'd been interested in doing that story because it is an issue that had affected me. And I think that I sort of put on my journalist hat and said, I'm going to learn about how this affects other people. And I just kept sort of having this pang of recognition when I was talking to folks. I think early on when I was first, like a kid, I was 22 years old, and I was the only person who spoke French in the office, so I ended up being sort of an effective case manager for people coming from, a couple families from the DRC. I also spoke Spanish, so a couple Cuban families. And I remember I would go home bawling and just being like so broken and so upset by what these people had experienced and were going through, even though I knew sort of intellectually that my pain had nothing to do with it and I needed to get the hell out of the way because it had nothing, it was, sort of what good did my tears do? I think, though, that lesson led me to do the opposite, which is like, this isn't about me, shut up, this isn't about your feelings. You don't get to have feelings about this. These people are struggling. It's your job to support them. Like, get a grip. And I don't actually think I learned through the process of writing the story that piece on vicarious trauma that did its own damage, such as chronic migraines and inability to sleep, etc. So, but it's an interesting line. And I found a lot of advocates who are hesitant to talk with me for this very reason. It's like, I don't want to make this about me. It's not about my pain. Of course, though, the advocates who are set up to support these people in a system where there's not a lot of support and in a system that is sort of designed to break people so that they'll just give up and go home, we actually need those advocates to be intact and well. So it can't just be true of shut up and deal with it, stiff upper lip, and yet it also can't be true that you can just fall apart.
Has the book helped you deal with it?
I think so. I mean, it's interesting because I'm sort of a character in this book and sort of turned the lens a little bit. One of the main crises of sort of personal crisis animating this book was what good is writing for? What good is journalism? Why am I a journalist? Does writing stories do anything? I think that was kind of a something that I was really tangling with in the book. I would say a little bit more than the kind of how do I show up in this broken world of deep sadness without myself breaking, but also without pretending that I'm not, I'm not at risk of breaking. So yeah, I mean, I think this book did help with that in part because I was turning the mirror on myself, if nothing else, and asking a few more meta questions about what am I doing here and what is my purpose here and how do I affect the most change given the tools at my disposal.
Well, I think you've really done a fantastic job. Lauren, many thanks for speaking to me. The book is A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks to my producer, Steph Chungu, who also edited this episode. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.